Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much to everybody for being here. As Tim already said, this is the second time we're doing this conference, so very excited to be at the West Coast this time. And in the big scheme of things, how we thought about this conference, where we try to move from the very big technological trends that we talked about this morning or heard about in the keynote and in the first panel, we want to gradually move towards some of the more policy questions on the more specific level. And in this particular panel, we wanted to hear about standardization policy and how it affects these different aspects. So we heard about the fact that there is global competition for leadership in technology standards. We heard about the fact that, for example, in the US, there is a strategy in place by the government that aims to promote and pursue US leadership in these standards. And obviously, we know that in Europe, there's a European standardization strategy, and probably the first world region to have developed very focused, very intentional standardization strategies was in Asia, with China leading as a leading example, with China 2035, and other standardization strategies in different regions of the world. So what we want to discuss a little bit in this panel is how these different standardization policies interact and how they promote or maybe endanger or fragilize a global standardization ecosystem. And we have a great panel with experts bringing in very different complementary perspectives on this, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of technology that they cover in their work. So to my left, we have Sukla Chandra, who is a licensing director with GE in India. And then Nigel Cory, who is at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And on the big screen behind me, we have Giulia Neaher, who is at the Atlantic Council. And the way we thought about this panel is that we first start by providing a little bit of factual perspectives on these questions. So first of all, let's divide the issues in geographically in some sense. So we are here in the US, and we have mostly a US-based crowd. So maybe one way to do this is to say let's focus on what's going on in the US and put it into context and compare and contrast it with what other world regions are doing. And maybe we can start with Giulia, who's behind me. And she has worked quite a lot on China and how standardization policy in the US and standardization policy in China interact. And so I wanted to hear from you, Giulia, your opening remarks and thoughts about this topic.
Sure. Thank you, Justus, for the introduction. And I'm pleased to be joining you all remotely. I hope my face isn't looming too threateningly over the conference. So I lead the standardization portfolio at the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. As Justus said, a lot of it is focused on the US-China relationship and how that applies in the standards space. We came out with a report last year on China's recent activity in the standards space and how the US should be looking at and addressing that policy. To make a long story short, we did find that I think there's been a lot of concern about China's increased engagement in standards to the effect of, China is trying to dominate the technology ecosystem. China is going to have undue influence over standards. And after speaking to a lot of experts and professionals in the standardization space, we did find that concern was in a lot of ways overblown. And so our goal was to assess that perceived threat, and also, how can the US learn from China's example and learn to develop a standards policy that maybe improves on what China is putting out. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail, Justus. But basically, I want to pause there. I don't want to take too much of an intro time, but I'm happy to go in a little bit more detail into kind of the misconceptions about China's standard strategy, if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to take a bit more time. I think we have the time, and I think that's very, very much at the core of what we want to cover in this panel. So if you don't mind,
Sure.
I think you can develop a bit.
Yeah, happy to. So some of the main misconceptions that we ran into were that, firstly, China is overrepresented in SDOs or is on the path to being overrepresented in SDOs. And after kind of, taking a look at the actual membership of the organizations, it became pretty clear that, the countries that are overrepresented are probably the US, Germany, and Japan. And China is increasing its engagement, but it's increasing its engagement in a way that in a lot of ways reflects its market share when it comes to technology and to these technologies that are eligible to be selected as standards. And then secondly, another misconception was that China's strategy of kind of increasing membership and putting out a lot of proposals that maybe weren't of the best quality, namely kind of putting an emphasis on quantity over quality in terms of proposals. The misconception here is that this strategy was necessarily going to work or that it was suited to the infrastructure of standards bodies. So, standards organizations are ideally consensus-based. They ideally take in a lot of input from stakeholders, including technical stakeholders who can really speak to the design and the technical merit of these technologies. And so just by nature of having more representatives in an SDO or by having more proposals out, one country isn't necessarily going to gain undue influence over an SDO. And then thirdly, the misconception that has become apparent is that China's standardization policy is being implemented with full support domestically within China. And after the China Standards 2035 policy came out, there was actually a lot of domestic infighting with regard to the increased freedom that it gave to the private sector when it came to collaborating with international standards organizations. And so that actually really slowed down the implementation of that plan. And so those three pieces, I think, are key misconceptions to the way that people have viewed China's threat, so to say, to the international standards system. I think that the most important takeaway going forward for the US is to kind of think about, okay, if China's strategy towards interacting with SDOs isn't necessarily tailored to the actual, day-to-day function of SDOs or the actual structures that make SDOs, then how can we do better and how can we create a different kind of strategy? And so I think that's where we get into the recent developments that we've seen, with more industrial policy and the Chips and Science Act and that kind of thing.
Okay, wonderful. So the next big world region that the US obviously trades a lot with and has a lot of policy interactions with is Europe. And Nigel, in addition to also covering US and China issues in much detail in your work, you also have worked on policy evolutions in Europe, such as the recent or the standardization strategy that is still being discussed and debated, and your views on how that affects global standardization.
Yep. First, it's great to be here amongst fellow standards nerds. Of my portfolio of issues, I don't get a lot of chance to do a deep dive into some of these topics. So thanks to Tim and the rest of the organising team for bringing us all together to talk about what I think is emerging as a key pillar of conflict and potential cooperation in the global battle for innovation and tech supremacy that Tim's opening comments and the opening panel spoke about. It has not got near as much attention as some of these other battles over data and specific like 5G or AI technologies. But to its credit, the EU recognised that it's a critical component to technology development and innovation, and it pulled together a very detailed and prescriptive strategy on it, which is all fine and good, but it's actually quite problematic in terms of how it's decided to design its tech standard strategy in the context of an emerging China and more pressingly for Europe, its ongoing efforts in terms of how to humble and undermine US tech in Europe. And that's, I suppose, one of the key features of it, in that perhaps US technical standards policy thus far has been driven by concerns over China's growing participation in tech standards, In contrast, Europe's, I think, is nearly in large part shaped by how can it use technical standards as a way to humble and undermine US tech as much as it does Chinese technology firms and products. And so we've seen them come up with this strategy, which essentially they frame in the context of using concerns about values and interests and how they are embedded in these technologies, which have an increasingly important role in the European economy and society. And then in a way that the US has not done, they've then sort of prosecuted that strategy through the various major pieces of legislation that they've considered over the last 12, 18, 24 months since the strategy came out, with the AI Act, the Data Act, in regards to the EU cloud cybersecurity scheme that they're developing. In each of these sort of verticals, pieces of legislation, as there are standards-related provisions, they're embedding the key concerns and components of the EU standard strategy, that namely being that they distrust the role of foreign experts and foreign firms in playing a role in helping to develop European standards, and that they're changing the rules about how foreign experts and foreign firms can play a role, as they have long done in a good faith effort to help develop European and international standards. And so in each of these areas, you see them narrowing the scope for open international standards engagement in Europe in these various sort of pieces of legislation and with regulations. And that's obviously highly problematic, and it presents in and of itself a threat to the open industry-led nature of the international standard system. But it's also It also reflects the broader tension, which the past panel mentioned, in terms of bringing to light in a European context how they prosecute the issue of values and technical standards, and what they want to do about that. And that's, as you mentioned, it's an evolving approach to this issue, but it represents I suppose a key theme or a key characteristic of the debate as it's playing out in Europe, and it's one slightly different to US, where the key value that's sort of emerging in the context of technical standards is that of national security, whereas in Europe it's about fundamental rights and other issues and concerns. So, but I'll leave it there and hand it back.
Thank you very much. And our third panelist, Sukla, you have the benefit of being based in India, of learning about a different world region, but also covering other regions, other parts of Asia, and as part of your work. So I think you have quite a global perspective, and you can comment on how standardization policy is taking shape in these countries, but also how U.S. standardization policy efforts are perceived and how they reverberate around these countries, and once again how that affects standardization at a global level.
Yeah, Justus, thank you so much, and great to be part of this conference. Thanks, team, for inviting me. So I'm based out of India and part of GE licensing group. So GE, of course, is a US company, and we have a very large footprint of R&D in India. So is everybody having a R&D group located in India. So innovation is happening as we speak every day for almost all MNCs across the globe, based out of India. So I have, what I wanted to talk about is kind of twofold. One is as the licensing group, so I'm responsible for our global operations, which we run in almost every country in Asia and Europe outside North America. We do have our colleagues in US who mostly run the US operation. So I want to talk a little bit about the standards, which I'm seeing kind of evolving in the areas where we are interested and operational in the licensing area, vis-a-vis as a global GE as a company, a manufacturing company, which is mainly focusing on aerospace, energy sector. GE Healthcare was part of GE. Now they are a separately listed company, but also maybe healthcare. So there are kind of two different ways I see standards evolving in Asia. So let me first talk about what I see as the main infrastructure related standardization which is happening in Asia. So I'll take an example of, say, energy. So you talk about national security. So energy security is a huge part of national security. So when I talk about India as a country, we don't have gas. We depend on coal even now today quite a bit. Although in the last 10 years we have put renewables into our mix quite a bit, but it's still a big part of it. So when we look at standardization and the standard policies, and of course we are part of IEC, ISO, all of that is there. But when we look at, say, standards very focused on grid, so when you look at the developed countries like Europe and US, the grids are stable, the grids has a different standard to follow, but suppose we take that standard and go to a country like a Vietnam or an India or an Indonesia, which is not there yet. You don't have a smart grid there in most of the places. And you put that same standard there. Are we helping that country to get to a point where they should be, or are we kind of stifling them? So that's the question I see the countries in Asia ask themselves a lot in the infrastructure sector. Same thing with, when you put renewable mix in the grid, a technology which plays a huge role is storage technology. Asia, if you look at lithium ion, the giants out there in Asia manufacturing those. If you look at Korea, China, all of that. So I see a very different way the countries they are looking at their own national security, energy security, market, making sure that their economies are not suffering if they are adapting to a standard which is globally applicable. Having said that, I think supply chain plays a huge role there. And let me give you an example of electric vehicle. So we all know that the market of electric vehicle and the number of companies working in electric vehicle in China is just huge, humongous. And India also is kind of developing in that area. But when we started dabbling with, looking at the standards of charging the electric vehicle, India as a country first started to look at their own standards. So they were very clear, let us develop our own standard, let us have that, and that's going to work for us. We are not going to adopt the international standard in that. Very quickly they realized that unless they adapt to the international standard, the cost of having a charging station and the cost of the components inside the car, which needs to be comparable to international standard, it's going to drive away the market from EV. And the focus of India government is to have a huge conversion of ICE engine to EV by 2030. That's not going to happen. So very quickly we saw the reverse thing happening. So what I'm saying is that the countries in Asia are very quickly kind of adapting to seeing what is economically, beneficial for that particular country's GDP growth to make sure that they're adapting to the standard. So that is for the infrastructure section. As a licensing leader, when I look at what I'm involved in, the standards in video codec, the standards in 5G, the standards in wireless power transfer, we play an important role there, and we actively participate in that. So for those, the IP regime is extremely important. How the litigation space is in each country, extremely important. As we are an US company, obviously there's a lot of strategic decision that gets done here. And my responsibility is to make sure that I give a very, candid opinion on what should be our strategy on standard essential patents and how do we drive that across Asia. And that's a very important market for us, which is India, which is China, which is Korea, Japan, Vietnam, all of them, and even Africa. So how do I enable the leadership team to take the right decision on how to drive standard essential patents there. So it's a very, and if you look at this country, excepting probably China, that's probably the most active space, and we follow it. I'm very interested to know Giulia's viewpoints on that, but we actively follow what's going on in China in the standard essential patent space, and we see so much focus from the highest level of Congress right now in China, trying to see some of the trends there. We see court cases being evolved, case laws being evolved around this, and definitely what is happening in Europe. We see a loud discussion going on in China right now on that. So I can elaborate more on that. But those are the kind of two things I just wanted to bring to the table, what I see happening in Asia.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we can see that standardization has moved to the forefront in policy debates. So there's more attention to standards at highest policy levels than there historically has been. And we see that in different world regions, the focus is different in nature a little bit, as Nigel has pointed out. So in the US, many of these discussions about standards, the highest policy levels are packaged in debates about national security. In Europe, we hear a lot about digital sovereignty or European values and fundamental rights with respect to technologies such as AI. And then in many other countries in the world, concern with standardization policy is mostly about the industrial development of the country and how to make sure that standards benefit the economic development of the country. So each of these dimensions is obviously important, and each region of the world cares about these dimensions, and each of these calls for some degree of policy involvement. But obviously these are policy issues where policy making mostly takes place at the national or maybe the regional level, and it has to interact with standards development that is technology focused, but it's also consensus based and international in nature. So in order to understand how this potentially problematic interaction takes place, we decided that we would take a second tour where we would divide this topic maybe a little bit more thematically rather than geographically. So where we speak about how the interaction between national interests in standardization and the global nature of the technology interacts. And so one of the most prominent, or maybe two of the most prominent fields in which this interaction is important are wireless communication and telecommunications such as 5G, 6G, and the other is AI. So we have heard about both of these today, and Giulia, you have studied both of these in your work. So we thought that you could give us some remarks about the interaction of national policy and international standards development in these two critical fields.
Sure. Well, I would love to be able to speak more to the 5G and telecom side of things. My expertise is more in the AI space, so I'll turn my attention a little bit more there. But I mean, I think that the core issue with, I think, a lot of U.S. policy with regard to standards is this key misunderstanding of what standards are for and what SDOs actually do. And so I think that, with the China question, you see policymakers who here China is getting really involved on this issue, and they think, okay, we need to jump in, we need to do the same thing in order to stay competitive. And they don't necessarily take the line of thought much further than that. And we see the same thing with AI, where we have this kind of global moment that AI is having right now, where it's very hot in the media, and a lot of policymakers are really starting to think about it who maybe hadn't been thinking about it before. And I think that, again, with the standardization question, you have policymakers thinking, okay, we need to get ahead of AI, we need to get ahead of AI standards, and we need to figure out how to make sure we're at the cutting edge in this area. And I think just as with the China question, you have some key areas of misconception when it comes to standards and AI. I mean, I think firstly, and at the highest level, standards for AI, you have to think about what you're going to standardize within AI. Is it the data processing? Is it the data collection? Is it the algorithm? Is it the testing? Is it the application? There are so many levels at which you could choose to regulate or standardize. And for standards to get truly granular enough to be effective, you are going to have to narrow it down to specific use cases, applications, elements of the technology. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is that there are these broad kind of principles when it comes to responsible AI or ethical AI and that kind of thing. And these are the words like transparency, accountability, responsibility that get thrown around a lot. And they are all, I think, useful and admirable goals for us to have when we think about AI. But I think that when it comes to standards, how do you standardize accountability across something as broad as AI that encompasses both technologies and applications and different kind of so many different sub-elements. And so there are just a lot of moving parts when it comes to standardizing AI. And I think that, if we, as we've seen a little bit with the EU, kind of expecting that standards become a system of enforcement for AI principles and AI ethics and that kind of thing. I think that assumption that standards are equipped to do that or are the appropriate venue for that, I think that should be reconsidered. And so I think that, it's similar and it's not similar to the China question, where policymakers, I think, need to have a much closer dialogue with professionals working in standards bodies and in the standards space to really understand what the structures and capabilities are within the SDO system.
Thank you very much. And interesting perspectives on AI, and I think we might have the opportunity to get back to some of this later in the discussion. But Nigel, you have also studied AI, and but you also, in addition to maybe developing some thoughts on AI, you also volunteered to provide some examples of some lesser known technology standards in other fields, and that illustrate this interaction that we are debating in this panel.
Yeah, so I'll talk briefly about AI just to provide a tangible example of how the European Union's approach is problematic, and then I'll talk about an example which I think best encapsulates the fragmentation that we're seeing from an overly disproportionately powerful and distorted lens of national security that the Biden administration is applying, especially as it relates to server energy efficiency standards. But firstly, on AI, the EU's proposed AI Act will oblige companies to meet yet-to-be-developed technical standards in order to demonstrate conformity. The problem is that they're relying on two solely European-based bodies to develop these, instead of leveraging the ongoing existing work that global experts are doing at the ISO, IEC, and other SDOs. Why this is problematic is that Europe is simply not home to all of the relevant AI experts that need to try and figure out and answer these tricky questions, which Giulia mentioned in terms of how do we standardize some of these AI-related questions. And worse still, as it's done this with the AI Act, it's sidelined the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, ETSI, over accusations of sort of disproportionate non-European influence, even though they already had ongoing work about how to standardize some of the AI-related issues that they're trying to legislate. And then on top of that is the fact that they've set an unrealistic 2-year goal for these two European standards bodies to develop this complex body of AI-related standards, which I think is just completely sort of unrealistic. And sort of goes to, I suppose, highlighting the failure for policymakers to fully understand what is involved in standards making, how tricky it is with these technologies, which are very broad and have many different uses. And so again, I think this example just highlights what we may see in 5 or 10 years' time on AI and other technologies if policymakers are basing their decisions off a misguided or poor understanding of how technical standards are made. The server energy efficiency standard separately stems from is I suppose a warning sign of what else we may see when we have disproportionate sort of national security concerns applied to technical standards. When the Biden administration sanctioned Huawei through its entity listing a few years ago, 4 years ago now, I think, they did not provide a broad and clear legal exemptions for standard relating activity that Huawei was involved in, even if this standards activity was completely not related to sort of like core national security concerns around, I don't know, telecommunications or data protocols or whatever it may be. And industry was upset because there is at that time there was one global standard called Spec Cert, which was used to test the energy efficiency of standards. It's actually more a benchmark than it is a standard, but it basically means that server companies have an apples to apples comparison when they test their servers as to how energy efficient they are, which can then be used by regulators to go, well, we obviously want to ensure that data centers use the most energy efficient servers, so we know what the testing regime is, and if we want to cut out like the 10% least energy efficient servers, we know what rating to set it at to sort of provide that market signal. And before this entity listing, there was one global standard, and Huawei was a member of the body, but was not even involved in the committee that managed this standard. They had agreed to adopt it in China, and the Chinese government was in the process of regulating this in its own way, and then the sanctions happened, and the lack of a standards-related exemption. And so Huawei was essentially booted out because these SDOs did not want to fall under sanctions-related legal compliance concerns. Huawei went back to the Chinese government and said, we've been booted out. We want to develop our own benchmarking system, and we want your help to do it. And so the Chinese government helped them. And so now we have a duplicative standard, which is objectively worse than the global standard. And it is now mandatory to use in the largest server market in the world. And it took the Biden administration 2 years to respond to these concerns. And then when it did, it still did not provide a broad and clear enough exemption. Only more recently has it done so, but by then the damage has been done. And so now we have Chinese firms going to European Union regulators saying, hey, we've been booted out of this global standard. So when you yourself are figuring out what standards to refer to in terms of energy efficiency, you also have to use our Chinese standard. And it's a black box. It's not transparent. There's no there's no consensus-based decision-making. It's not open. And so there's the real threat that they could just fiddle with the levers to make Chinese firms look better than US and other foreign firms. And so anyway, I just mentioned that case because I think it encapsulates the type of challenges we're probably increasingly going to run into as policymakers don't account for how standards actually are made and work.
Yeah, thank you very much. These are great illustrative examples, and it's also good to hear about technologies that we don't hear about as commonly or as often as some of these others. And Sukla, you already mentioned some of the technologies that you mostly focus on in your daily work, but maybe you can develop it a bit further about the implications of the different policies in different world regions and how they affect standards in your field, meaning mostly infrastructure and energy and these critical technologies.
So maybe I can give you one example about, something which is related to energy, because that's where GE is very active on. So when you look at, electricity generated by coal, all of us are very aware that that's something fossil fuel is something which is every government is trying to move away from. You have Kyoto Protocol. A lot of countries have signed that, and including India. And there are some countries which they have not signed that protocol. So, but the countries who have signed that protocol, they are obligated to do certain steps in the coming years to make sure that they actually abide by the commitment to reduce carbon footprint. And so when I look at that stringent requirement which is there to make sure that that happens, and the standards which are there in the developed economies, bringing them directly is something I have seen happening in a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. I'm leaving China out because China is way ahead in the sense, like, if you look at the carbon footprint and the technology to reduce that, I think China has been very proactive, and they have done it, I would say, almost 7 to 8 years back, or maybe a decade back. Whereas the other countries in Southeast Asia are just catching up to that. So quickly, I think most of the countries realize that in order for us to do that and get to where China is, it requires a huge amount of investment and get to the standards, which is like the global standard on what kind of carbon you can release, what kind of sulfur you can release. There is very stringent requirement for that. So what I see these countries have done is they are not getting those standards down. The goal is still the same. What the country government is playing is with a timeline. So they're giving the companies or industry and also the government entities themselves some time to get to the point where they can achieve that. But because the kind of investment that is required in infrastructure to get there, I see that flexibility happening. And we get directly impacted because GE as a business, we work in renewables, we work in coal, we are getting out of coal right now. So we need to be on top of what a country is thinking, because Asia is a huge market for us. So we need to be able to think that we used to think that these are the countries we are going to have a lot of business in clean coal, in cleaning all this and the latest technology in that. But what we are realizing now is a lot of countries are pushing that out a few years. So definitely, I see the governments have the intention of getting to the global standard as far as infrastructure is concerned, but giving themselves a little bit of time to get there is happening everywhere. That's the trend I'm seeing. On the other side, which is very, very, consumer electronics space, which I think most of the people in this room are involved in, it's a very different kind of scenario in the sense like, again, when I look at China, I would leave out China from Asia because they have their own set of development which are happening, and which is sometimes encouraging. Sometimes it is what's happening in European Union on the standard essential pattern is getting an influence on China, and that's actually triggering a lot of actions from companies like ourselves as to what should be our strategy in China vis-a-vis what should be our strategy in India, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. And sometimes they are strikingly different because of what is happening on the ground. And I just want to make sure that we understand that when we are developing a strategy around standard essential patent on how do we enforce them, how do we participate in pools, how do we do any bilateral in these areas, whether it's video codec, whether it's 5G, whether it's wireless power transfer, all of those standard participation which we are doing right now. How do we make our strategy flexible depending on what we see happening in the country? And that's why I said that initially also the judicial system and the IP regime is absolutely important for us to take that decision. And I think in the IPBC panel, there was a panel on why should we hear about China, and we talked a little bit about the other countries also, and that in China, we are seeing there are some injunctions happening, which is conditional in the sense like you're almost encouraged that if you go and pay this damage, then this injunction is not applicable. And is that something the other countries are going to follow? I'm seeing discussions happening everywhere where this is kind of taken as an example, and so the implementers of the standard essential patents are encouraged by that, because an unconditional injunction is something, it's available in India actually. It is there. But ultimately, end of the day, injunction really doesn't solve the entire problem. We also have to have the damage, and if you are holder of standard essential patents, you have put in either humongous amount of money developing those standard essential patents. So just getting an injunction is not enough. What's the next step? And probably these conditional injunctions which we saw happening in China will really help the other countries go that way. So it's kind of an evolving space right now. Also, another thing which I see is very different in different countries is when I look at the entire supply chain and how the companies are setting up manufacturing units, and people who work in standard essential patents know that it's very important where it is getting manufactured a lot of times. When I look at Vietnam, and Vietnam is becoming extremely important as a manufacturing hub, a lot of times Vietnam allows companies to come and just assemble their unit in Vietnam. Whereas a country like India is very specific that if you are going to have a factory there, whether you're Apple, whether you're Tesla, we want the supply chain to be integrated, and only then the government is going to give the go-ahead to do that. So it's a very basic, although both Vietnam and India are going to leverage the opportunities in the manufacturing sector, and which is deeply connected to the standard essential patents of the consumer sector, consumer electronic sector, I do see very different policies in India versus Vietnam, and how it's impacting our strategy as we want to move forward. So I would like to say that no country is same. There are very, very nuances as we go, and Asia is a big market for everyone, but I see a very different kind of policies playing out in each of the countries.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you also for already introducing some of the policy topics regarding standard essential patents and patents, which we're going to move to in a second. But before we do that, I just wanted to open the floor to the three panelists on a more general level. So we've gradually moved up from country by country perspective to more like a technological tour. And we heard a lot of criticism of government approaches. So Giulia mentioned the misconceptions that are shaping thinking about China's participation in global standards. Nigel, you and also was critical of the European approach to AI, which you also have criticized, Nigel. And you also highlighted the dangers of this heavy emphasis on national security in the US standardization policy. But I think that Sukla's remarks, that you also show that maybe a little bit more like the importance of an intentional standardization policy in driving industrial development in the country, and I also think that it's important to acknowledge that the nature of technology has changed in some way. And so I wanted to, in light of your criticisms in your remarks, I wanted to ask basically, what is your take on, like, first of all, do you agree with the premise that the nature of the technology as it is today is such that it warrants a more political approach to standardization, or is that already on such a fundamental level, is that already flawed? And if it does call for a more political approach to standardization, a greater emphasis or greater participation of government in standards and in the shaping of technology standards, what would be a better approach for that to take place, given the current state of multilateralism and the current state of globalization, which doesn't necessarily make it easy to achieve that in a one standardized multilateral forum? So basically, it's what is your reading, first of all, of the premise of this debate, and then second, what is your suggestion as an alternative to the standardization policy that is taking shape in the different world regions? So whoever wants to go first on this, I mean, there's no established order here.
I'll take a first swing. I don't think the nature of our technology necessarily changes what we should expect from the standardization system. Unfortunately, I think that because technical standards get mentioned more often in the context of these technologies, that they're loaded with expectations of in terms of what they should develop. That the standard system was never designed to produce, which means that when it does produce what it should, there's sort of like this expectation that, well, that's not what we actually want, and so we want to fiddle with how standards are made because we want to have our hands on the levers a little more directly than we did in the past. I think that is a foundational point in misconceptions in both the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. Just don't clearly understand the role of standards and how they're made and what they're done. They're not a silver bullet to all associated concerns related to a technology. Obviously, legislation and regulation provides a critical framework and context for standard setting bodies to sort of use as a guiding star as they go about their technically focused work. So I think that's the first part of it. That means that standards work, I mean, obviously will come under greater scrutiny, which is fine. It should entail greater participation, which is fine if it's on a technical basis, in terms of like having more people in the room. As long as they're able to contribute on a technical basis, then that's all fine and good, and that there are ways to encourage more stakeholders to do that. But upending the consensus-based decision-making model to favour certain participants, whether they be government or civil society, I think is very risky in changing how technical standards are made. And so I think what that then points towards is like, well, what else should governments do? Given this heightened concern about these technologies and these funny things called technical standards, the first thing is that they just need to get a better awareness of what exactly is going on in terms of technical standards with these critical and emerging technologies, who's involved, how they're made, how it's heading, what considerations, what concerns are they taking into consideration, and that is based on public-private information sharing to a degree that we just don't have at the moment. The Biden administration has a very poor track record in terms of drawing on or seeking out private sector engagement on standards as it talks with the European Union at the Trade and Technology Council, or India, Japan, Australia and the Quad or elsewhere. And so that leads to this sort of government-heavy, government-dominated approach to standard setting. I think that type of engagement is foundational for governments to be like, okay, all of this is going on, but like our actual core national security concerns related to this application or this subsector, which gets to the sort of the phrase that gets used more often that one of the previous panelists mentioned of like small gardens, high walls, in terms of like being very more nuanced in terms of like applying their greater level of scrutiny due to valid sort of national security concerns. I think those the awareness and information sharing on one hand, and then the targeted application of those concerns in a constructive way are sort of obviously related and are key to ending up with the type of policies we're seeing, which sort of bring into question the broader international standard system, which is unfortunately one of the misconceptions that Giulia mentioned, is that national security and intelligence community folks in this country, some of them see standard setting as zero sum, and that they see China as winning and therefore the US is losing, and that growing Chinese participation impugns the entire standard system, and so that leads to some of the misguided policies and strategies we see with standards. And so again, reverting back to this information sharing, understanding and targeted application of concerns would put us on a better path to protecting the broad international standard system, which does everything we want it to do in terms of innovation and competition and trade, without sort of undermining that.
Thank you. How about the other panelists want to weigh in on your general take of the current state of standardization policy and whether it warrants a more political approach at all, and if so, or what would be your recipes for that?
I'm happy to jump in there. I think, I would echo a lot of what Nigel said. I think that, first of all, I don't think that there's really any way to walk back the increased interest in standards that we're seeing from governments and from policymakers. I think it's going to be difficult to say, no, you actually don't need to worry about it. It's okay. I just don't think that that's realistic. And so I think it's a matter of trying to figure out how to tailor government interaction with standards bodies so that it's more peripheral, or so that the government is kind of working in support of existing standards activities rather than inserting itself into those activities. And so I think that what Nigel was saying about public-private partnership, I think that's really important in terms of, maintaining those channels of communication and keeping those open. I think that tangible ways that the government can, work to support SDO activity are through, things like industrial policy. Within the, we saw in the CHIPS and Science Act a lot of investment in domestic innovation. And, if you subscribe to the view that standards bodies are, selecting the optimal, the most suitable technology to be utilized as a standard, the thing that is going to set a country apart is not necessarily number of representatives in an SDO, but quality of technologies that are being produced. And so if governments can work to invest more in domestic technology sectors, I think that's a good way to kind of boost one's profile within SDOs, while also boosting the quality of technologies that are being produced. I think other kind of strategies that have come up in my work that have been more interesting or appealing are, the government supporting more regular SDO meetings. So, for example, the US federal government funding ANSI to meet more regularly, and kind of potentially also subsidizing participation in SDOs for people who may not be able to afford membership fees. and that way including more people from like small or medium enterprises, people who may not have the resources to attend or join, people from civil society and that kind of thing. And so I think that there are a number of ways for government to participate in the standard system without directly undermining it. And I think that the political engagement with standards needs to kind of reframe to follow that track. And I've seen a little bit of it already, but obviously needs a lot of improvement.
Thank you. And the fourth topic that we had on our list, and Sukla, I'd like to give you the word on that, is so now that we've debated a little bit the problematic interplay between these national policies and international standardization, and debated the proper ways of implementing that, we want to apply that to the topic that is close to many people's heart here, which is patents, patent licensing, standard essential patent. So where we have similar interactions between policies defined at the national or regional level and the standards to which they apply, which are global in nature. And this is something I understand that you deal with on a regular basis as a licensing professional for a US-based company responsible for licensing activities in different world regions. So I'd like you to comment a little bit on that, and what's your view on the recent developments in this regard?
So before I jump into that, I just wanted to add something which we heard from her, and I completely agree on one thing, is that government can play a big role and is playing a big role in many countries in developing, not hindering the developing of standard, but facilitating that in two ways. First of all is open dialogue between government and public and private, to everybody participate, because you only get the voice of the market, what really market needs in every region, once you involve all the parties which are going to be affected by this. And that's absolutely important, to have that open kind of dialogue going on. I know that can slow down the progress a little bit, but ultimately a standard which is going to be beneficial for every region, that's extremely important. I know ISO, IC, they are extremely involved in almost all countries, and they have the national level committee as well, but a lot of times we are seeing a lot of bureaucracy around that in different countries, and I think that's opening up as we speak, but that's one thing which we should do more. And the second part is direct funding from the government to develop technologies which are coming from an organization which is very rich in R&D and how we look at technology. Even then, a private company to look at a technology which is going to be there maybe 5 years or 10 years down the line, obviously every company has a certain resources to kind of invest in that, but a government can play a huge role in developing that kind of long-term technology and making sure that get into standard which beneficial for everybody. So I think on the funding side as well as the dialogue side, government can really, and I'm not talking about US or Europe or any Asia, I'm talking about any government, and that's going to be depending on, doesn't matter how developed your economy is, that's going to help the economy in both ways. So I just wanted to kind of agree and reiterate that point, and I see that happening in many governments in Asian countries. Now, coming down to your question, or you wanted me to comment on that, I think there are two things, and I talked about the judicial system already. There is another thing, which is the IP regime and how strong IP regime is. When you are in United States, and we heard from the USPTO person, and it's very robust system, developed completely. There are many countries in the world who follow that regime, but when you go outside Europe and US, there is China. If you look at the number of patents being applied there, it's just humongous number. I mean, you can't even, it's just a staggering number. But if you look at the other countries, they are kind of coming up. I have seen that change in the last decade in India, the strength of the IP regime, where when I started looking at patents and what we see now happening, there's a sea of change, and that has come across as one of the key enabler when you look at standards. Because when you look at standards, a lot of times you look at patents, and if you look at patents, one, they need to be valid in particular one jurisdiction, and in order to do that, you need to have a grant. And if you take a grant which takes 10 years to come, then probably you lose out a lot of your value already. So there are many ways we can influence the IP regime in different countries in a positive way, looking at the best practices from the countries which are already there. So that's one thing which I see happening, and that's extremely important for us to have our standard essential patent monetization strategy across the globe. How strong a particular IP regime is, how soon we can get the patent granted. And the second piece is definitely, once the patent is granted, can we even protect my patent there? Can we even leverage and monetize there? Because do we have the support there? And I think some countries are way ahead in Asia than the others. And I'm not looking at Japan and China. I'm looking at the other smaller countries because those are very developed IP regime, I would say, compared to the other countries at this point in time. And then ultimately, what's the litigation space there? How the litigation and the case laws are supporting licensors, licensees, what kind of trend we are seeing out there. Is it more on mediation or is it more on damage based? I mean, those are few things we look at, definitely when we develop our overall strategy. And then we look at the trends as to, especially in the consumer electronics, those kind of areas we work on, where is the trend? Where companies are going for the next level of investment in manufacturing? Is this market exploding? When we look at cell phones, I mean, the number of cell phones which get sold in China and India, it's just, the number itself is staggering because we are talking about 3.5 billion people. And a lot of people have multiple phones. And it's a multiplication factor, and those are the number of phones we are looking at. So the market is exploding in certain areas. So those are kind of consideration for us to have a strategy around standard essential patents. How do we develop the portfolio? Where do we apply more? And of course, Africa, I'm not forgetting that, because that's one area which is going to, I think we should definitely give a lot of importance to that, because that's up and coming, and we don't get to hear about that much in any forum. But I have traveled extensively in Africa, not in this licensing role when I was part of GE Power, but I have seen that continent kind of coming up. So that's another continent probably we should look at.
Okay, excellent. So in the interest of time, because we also want to let the audience ask questions, maybe do the other panelists have something very important to say about the last topic on standard essential patent policy and how it illustrates this interplay between national policy and global standards? And otherwise, I'd like to open up the floor now for the audience to ask questions and offer their own comments to the topics that we discussed here today.
Just as a comment and question, Nigel said in his first sentences, it's good to see so many standard nerds here. That shows me there are not so many people yet interested in that. And then Giulia said there's so much misperception of certain facts on standards that policy doesn't understand. What do you think? How could there can be more funding on supporting standardization, but I see we need a lot more education and what that actually is, because it is maybe a bit nerdy, but people should know, the reasons, how it works, how it's set up. Are there initiatives that would educate that, or make it more, maybe not that the general interest only in standards, but also the standards development?
That was one part of the US standard strategy for critical and emerging technologies in terms of putting in place resources so that those folks that may have a technical role to play in standards are aware of that and are sort of educated about what that looks like. But I don't think it goes near enough as to what's necessary to provide a clear and consistent treadmill for folks that are coming up in the sector, to recognise that as their career evolves, that standardisation work should be a part of that. I think that's a underdeveloped piece of the puzzle that deserves much for attention. And it sort of relates to one throwaway recommendation that we've pushed to Congress in terms of it's just expensive to engage in this stuff, right? And so it's one thing to bring them up and train them, but then you've got to provide the incentive for companies to invest in that education and in their engagement in standards activities. And so like we've made the explicit call for Congress to modify the research and experimentation tax credit to allow international standard settings cost to qualify as an expenditure for the purpose of it, to again sort of provide that financial incentive so that if they invest in this, they realise like there's more in it for them to support that over time. And what that hopefully leads to is a bigger cadre, a more standardization savvy workforce in these new and emerging technologies.
So if there's nothing more from the audience, I'd like to seize the opportunity to comment a little bit on the fourth topic in particular, and I think it illustrates a little bit the broader topic here. So when there are divergences in the world between the focus that different policymakers place on different values and these values interrelate with one shared common technology. So there are different ways you can think of how that plays out. I mean, one way is what many people call fragmentation. Is basically the idea, okay, we develop just in different parallel tracks, which ultimately makes the development of common standards between these regions unsustainable, and then we also develop on parallel tracks in the technological area, which I think nobody can really advocate as something that we would want or that would achieve benefits for consumers. And the other is obviously like, it's okay, we need to talk among policymakers first and put everything on the table, and then we achieve this grand multilateral conference where we solve all the problems, which I think we kind of understand is not within reach right now. And so the alternative is some kind of game theoretic game where every country develops its own policy, very conscious of how other policymakers in other regions of the world will respond to that. And it's becoming kind of the key strategic variable in devising a policy. Okay, how will the other policymakers react to that and respond to that? And then like, that really shapes the policy thinking. And I've seen, or I've thought quite a lot about policymaking in the EU on both standardization and standard essential patents in recent years. And you hear quite a lot from policymakers in Europe. Fragmentation is happening, like, so it's kind of there's this stance, okay, it's a foregone conclusion, we won't get this international compromise, and so let's, to some extent they justify that to just go ahead with their own policy proposals and say, okay, that means that we should shape the thing. But I think what they really want is what they call the Brussels effect, is basically to say like, it's okay, we do the right thing, then everybody looks at what we did, and then they will follow, and then that's going to shape a global standard. It's not that they want to isolate Europe from the rest of the world, but they want to push the world in a direction that is obviously informed or determined by European values. And the danger of that is that it kind of leads other countries that disagree with the direction where things are going, that they say, okay, we need to do the same thing, and then fragmentation kind of follows as an unintended consequence of this game theoretic game in a way.
The type of Brussels effects is quite different to what they intended in that way, in terms of like the Brussels effects leading to further fragmentation rather than some sort of harmonization.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, so it's the Brussels effect, you could say, initially was about harmonizing between different EU member states, and that's still the legal basis for all these interventions. It's like it's necessary in order to achieve the single market. It's necessary in order to abolish fragmentation within Europe, but then like obviously all this policy making in the current policy cycle is not about the trade barriers between European countries, but it's really about the interface or the interaction between Europe and the rest of the world in the digital space. And so I think that this is really also it's very apparent in the standardization regulations sphere, where, as you said, there is this emphasis on European values, and we need to make sure that European standards are driven by European players who understand and implement European values. But it also really comes into play when it comes to standard essential patents, where we have technologies that are global, and basically the essentiality of these technologies is not only a European phenomenon. You cannot say, okay, this is a patent, or this invention is essential in Europe, and then we license it in Europe, and then we will take care of the rest of the world later. nobody thinks that this can work. But then like it's okay. We just go out with a very assertive regulatory proposal in the hope that somehow down the road, this is gonna translate into some kind of worldwide regulated solution that makes sense. So I think that this is kind of this interesting geopolitical dimension or dynamic that we're facing, which is basically a consequence of the larger game or the larger global situation that we're in, where we have like different world regions translating different policy priorities and objectives into standardization policy, but we all still share the same space without having a single policymaker that would be able to do that for us on the worldwide level. So I mean, these are some. It's not really a question or comment, but it's kind of my perspective based on European evolution. So maybe you can relate that to things that you're observing in your work, that maybe more related to China or more related to other countries in Asia or the US itself, or maybe just comment on whether you think that makes sense.
No, I think I'm glad you took the moderator's prerogative and intervened, because Justus's work on EU standards policy deserves reading for anyone interested. I think what it also highlights is that it raises the question, well, Europe obviously wants to take a more direct role in it. How does it work with what the refrain is like like-minded value-sharing partners? Because if like the EU and US and Japan can get on the same page, then you're already more than halfway there to sort of setting a sort of global normal standard in another context approach. But yet what we see is that, say, for example, in the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which is the new forum that the two sides have created in the last 2 years to try and do this, is that it's just not leading to this sort of future potential sort of alignment, fragmentation in hope of future alignment. In that what the outcomes we've seen are like the lowest hanging fruit of not huge value, while the US has failed to sort of push back on the EU's efforts to fragment the system, while it's saying that it wants to work with the US on setting technical standards. And so I just mentioned that because it just highlights just how difficult building new alignment on top of the international standard system, which is already based on long-established World Trade Organization principles, is going to be.
Justus, I have one quick clarification for
Yep.
Giulia, if I may.
Yes, please.
So, Giulia, you said in the beginning about the misconceptions of China's standard strategy. What I was trying to understand is misconceptions by whom? Who has these misconceptions? Is it the policymakers you're talking about, or who exactly, or the world at large, or?
I think very much the policymakers on the U.S. side. I think people who are actually within the standard space have a much more balanced perspective on China's engagement in SDOs, saying that they have a large market share, they should be involved in testing and assessing these standards. I think there are a lot of people who are more hawkish on China in Washington who have jumped to conclusions about China's influence over standards simply. Just because I think it's a matter of saying, okay, here's our perceived rival, and they are throwing a lot of time and energy at this subject that I didn't know anything about before, which is standards. So that must mean that I should do the exact same thing, or they're going to beat me at this race. And I think that there's kind of a competitive mindset that gets in the way of thinking realistically about standards bodies. And I think it comes down to what we've been mentioning a lot towards the latter half of this panel, which is just educating government and having that public-private dialogue so that people on both sides understand where the other is coming from. And so I think that when I say these misconceptions, I really do mean the kind of the foreign policy community in Washington and to an extent in Europe as well.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, this is what the thought process was within the standards bodies, people themselves. Maybe when this influx of the Chinese participation in standards began about 15 years ago, and very soon it became clear to those who were in the standards that that's not exactly how it works, because you can't compensate volume for quality in an organization that is based on consensus-based, the rise to the top best standards. You can put 10,000 people there, but that doesn't mean you're going to get 10,000 standards out of it. Most of them just fall by the wayside,
Exactly.
just
And
a lot
if
of
the
noise.
if the policymakers on the US side had learned from that experience that was had internally within the standards community 15 years ago, there wouldn't have been a need to have this kind of more public debate on the Hill
Actually,
about it. And so I think, again, it boils down to communicating.
Yeah, that's why it's a little surprising to see that the policymakers are now kind of jumping on these points, which are sort of a settled debate within the bodies themselves.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe to that point, and a comment or maybe a question for you also. I mean, I think there are two variants of the debate on the concerns or potential concerns with China's aspirations to have more leadership roles in these SDOs. I mean, clearly the uninformed one, or the one that I think the standards organizations have pushed back against, is kind of this hawkish view where whenever a Chinese person or an individual affiliated with a Chinese company is in some kind of chair role, that's kind of the direct route to hell, where like it's everything is going to be dominated by the Chinese government now, and where like it's people have pointed out that their role is not currently oversized with respect to their part in the economy, and that the nature of standards development is such that the chair cannot dictate the work, and so on and so on. So I think that people in this room understand that these arguments are not necessarily borne out by facts. But then the more illuminated version of the argument is basically saying we all wish to live in a world in which governments understand how standards work and how standards work best, which is when basically government has this hands-off approach and doesn't necessarily interfere and doesn't tip the scales of the balance and so on. But in the moment where one government actor in a significant part of the world starts to become proactive and starts to provide very active, very targeted incentives for individuals to reach certain positions with a clear strategy behind to use these positions to further policy goals, then that kind of eliminates the premise that we in other world regions should continue our whole hands-off approach. It basically challenges our policy preference for a hands-off approach, because it's one thing to have a hands-off approach when everybody else has a hands-off approach, but it's an entirely different thing to be continuing to have an hands-off approach when there is one important actor or several important actors that have a very much hands-on approach. So I think that these two different arguments are very different in nature, and I think the second one has more substance to it. So maybe Giulia, you can comment on that, or also the other panelists on your view.
I'll provide a concluding comment and then we'll wrap up and get you to lunch. I think what it also highlights is that where the focus of our attention should be for the type of malign Chinese engagement that policymakers are worried about should be focused is the International Telecommunications Union, which is the organization where we see these problematic standards policies get so much media attention on facial recognition, on deep packet inspection, on a new IP in terms of architecture for the internet. That's where the focus should be, because the ITU doesn't have the same principles and processes that act as a safeguard in the vast majority of the rest of the SDOs. And so by the engagement there impugning the rest of the system, we have this problematic undertone. So in terms of like focusing and directing your attention towards the type of hands-on manipulation you're worried about, then like pick your targets, I suppose, is okay. My final point before we get to lunch.
Okay. Well, then I'm being told that we are going over time, so I'll save my other questions and comments, and then please join me in thanking the panelists for what I think was a really lively and thoughtful and interesting discussion, and let's all head out to lunch.